Hey everybody, this is a piece from Eduard Bernstein's Socialism Then and Now, Controversial Issues of Socialism in the Past and Present. I'm actually getting this piece from the German section of Marxist.org, and I'm using Google Translate to tell me what it says. I usually find that German Translate is pretty good. I mean, especially if for history stuff, maybe that probably wouldn't work for theory or philosophy as much, because the precise language is extra important. Still important in history, but not quite to the same extent. But the section that I'm reading is a section called the Bolshevik variant of socialism. And the reason I'm reading this is just trying to get a feel for some of the international socialist opinions about the early Soviet Union. And it has a little table of contents thing here, but I don't know if they actually correspond to whatever, but here are some basic points. The Communist Manifesto and the formula of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the rise of Bolshevism's predecessors, the utopians of the socialist revolution, the reformist element in Marxism. Marx ties the victory of socialism to economic maturity. Bolshevism seeks to impose maturity by force. Its superstition in the creative power of force. Trotsky's learning to ride on the back of the nation. Marxism demonstrates the limits of will. Bolshevism ignores the limits of will. Incompetent experimentation. The imitation of czarist despotism. The blood guilt of Bolshevism. So here we go. What are the basic ideas of the doctrine we have come to know as Bolshevism? What is it based on? In the first volume of his great work, Das Kapital, Marx describes the various methods of the so-called, quote, primary accumulation, end quote, of capital, i.e. the original formation of capital in Chapter 25, Section 6, which deals with the genesis of industrial capitalists. In contrast to the accounts of bourgeois economists who attribute the formation of capital to, quote, saving, Marx demonstrates that capital arose in a completely different way and writes regarding the methods of this true original accumulation of capital, quote, in England, at the end of the 17th century, they were systematically summarized in the colonial system, the national debt system, the modern tax system, and the protectionist system. These methods are partly based on the most brutal violence, like the colonial system, but all of them use state power, the concentrated and organized violence of society, to promote the transformation of the feudal into the capitalist mode of production in a greenhouse-like manner, and to shorten the transition. Violence is the midwife of every old society that becomes pregnant with a new one. It is itself an economic force. End quote. Marx. The end of this sentence, which is omitted here, has played a peculiar role in the socialist movement of our time among parties that derive their theoretical insights directly from Marx. French socialists who called themselves Marxists, one of whose leaders was Paul Lafargue, Karl Marx's son-in-law, and the other, Jules Gued, a friend of Marx, propagated in a dogmatic interpretation as proof that all socialist activity must aim at the conquest of political power through revolutionary force. It should be noted, however, that in this sentence, Marx simply states a historical fact but does not establish a formula for its immediate application. Footnote: how little Marx agreed with the interpretation Lafargue gave to his statements is evident from his letter to Friedrich Engels of the 11th of November 1882. There, Marx writes to his friend that Lafargue is in fact a student of the Russian Bakunin, and angrily exclaims, quote, Longuet, parenthesis, Marx's other son-in-law, end parenthesis, as the last Proudhonist, and Lafargue is the last Bakuninist, end exclamation point. Que le diable le importe? Exclamation point. I have no idea what that last bit means. Anyway, end footnote. However, the faction of Russian socialists who call themselves Bolsheviks turned this statement of historical fact into an imperative for all socialist policy. We must have the power to build the new society. There is no other way. Our entire thoughts and efforts must be directed towards the conquest of political power. This view, however, could be based on certain passages in the Communist Manifesto. For example, at the end, where the proletariat's conquest of power is discussed, it states, quote, "We have already seen above that the first step in the workers' revolution is the elevation of the proletariat to the ruling class, the conquest of democracy. The proletariat will use its political power to gradually wrest all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e. of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the mass of productive forces as rapidly as possible. This can, of course, initially only be achieved by means of despotic interventions in property rights and in bourgeois production relations. That is, by measures that appear economically inadequate and untenable, but which, in the course of the movement, exceed themselves and are unavoidable as a means of overturning the entire mode of production." End quote. Marx. Then a series of measures, Marx and Engels. Then a series of measures are listed that correspond to certain measures taken by the bourgeoisie in previous revolutions. The proponents of this line of thinking further refer to a passage in Karl Marx's letter on the draft unification program of German social democracy of 1875. The draft Gotha program. There, Marx states, quote, "Between capitalist and communist society lies the period of revolutionary transformation of capitalist society into communist society. Corresponding to this is a period of political transition whose state can be nothing other than the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat." End quote. Marx. This sentence, too, is dogmatically interpreted by the Bolsheviks as the word Bolsheviks as the word Bolsheviks has been adopted into German. Again, this is probably an awkward translation. This party, which today, as the party of Russian communists, stands at the head of the Third, or Communist International, formerly also called itself the Party of Maximalists. In the dispute among Russian Marxists, two schools of thought had emerged. One wanted to lead the struggle of Russian social democracy with a program of minimum socialist demands, quote, "minimum program," end quote, similar to that which the French Marxists had developed at the time with an introduction written for them by Marx. The other took the position that one had to establish a maximum of demands and constantly hold them before the movement as a kind of beacon. Of these two schools of thought, the latter is precisely that of the Bolsheviks, while the former is called the faction or party of the Mensheviks, names that more or less correspond to the terms that are related partly to the level of demands, partly to the numerical ratio of the supporters. The dispute largely degenerated into a scholastic playing off of Marx's statements, with one side ignoring the fact that all of Marx's teaching is primarily a theory of development, and that Marx himself had undergone a development over the years. Engels repeatedly acknowledged that he and Marx had made significant errors about the speed and course of development in the early epoch of their work. But does this mean that Marx's teachings themselves are dismissed? Certainly not. The great lasting feature of Marxism, which stands above all individual applications, is precisely the fact that Marxism has given the theory of social development a new foundation which is unshakable in its main idea, the theory of the determining influence of the mode of production. Marx repeatedly expressed the organic development idea of his teachings very definitely. For example, in the preface to his 1859 work, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, and again in 1866 in the preface to Capital. In the latter, Marx says, which is very remarkable for his point of view, that even the ruling classes of the present day are beginning to realize that present-day society is, quote, not a solid crystal, end quote, but, quote, an organism capable of transformation and constantly in the process of transformation. Quote, an organism capable of transformation and constantly in the process of transformation, end quote. Marx. This shows the contrast in fundamental views that distinguish the vast majority of social democratic parties today from the Bolshevik Party and its Western European imitators. The Bolshevik Party emerged from the Marxist school of Russian socialism. It is noteworthy that the very three personalities who can be called the true founders of this school, the late George Plekhanov and recent the recently deceased Ferris Sasulich and the still living Paul Axelrod were opponents of the Bolsheviks, or rather, Axelrod is one of them. While I noted above that the Bolsheviks proceed scholastically in their appeal to Marx, I would like to add that I consider scholasticism to be that intellectual movement or intellectual activity that is directed toward providing deductive proofs for already established doctrines or ideas, often using forced interpretive techniques. The inductive element, the examination of facts, is extraordinarily neglected, if not entirely unexamined. Now, the essential character of Marx and Engels' theory of social development is that it places emphasis on the close, one can most justifiably say organic connection between the political and social with the facts of economic development, that is, of the relations of production. From this standpoint, the authors of the Communist Manifesto, however revolutionary their thinking was for their time, and however unreservedly they had sided with the communist ideas of the advanced wing of the workers' movement of their day, nevertheless, even as they were developing their theory, they took a stand against the radical socialists of their day who were considered revolutionary communists, but who in fact only had a claim to the designation of utopians of the socialist revolution. Among them was undoubtedly the talented but scientifically untrained German communist Wilhelm Weitling, author of Guarantees of Harmony and Freedom, which appeared in 1842 and was hailed by Marx as highly noteworthy. This did not, however, prevent Marx from later sharply criticizing Weitling when his agitation alienated the workers with excessive radicalism. This is of interest because Weitling's ideas bear similarities to many slogans preached to workers today by adherents of Bolshevism. In the winter of 1846-47, Weitling came to Brussels, where Marx and Engels were living at the time, developing and polemically advocating their great theory. During a visit Weitling paid to Marx, the Russian writer Annenkov was present, and in his memoirs he describes a violent clash between Marx and Weitling. Weitling, who had come from the working class, relied heavily on this, as well as the emotional side of his theory, when confronting Marx. It is remarkable how vigorously Marx, after Annenkov, emphasized to Weitling the indispensability of concrete scientific thought, once angrily exclaiming, pounding his fist on the table, quote, "Never has ignorance benefited anyone," end quote. Marx. Four years later, after the revolution, Marx came into conflict with his former comrades in arms who, like Weitling, appealed to feeling and will. They were the faction of the Communist League led by Karl Schapper and A. Willich. This conflict was repeated in the years 1870 to 1872 in the International Workingmen's Association in Marx's struggle against the Russian Socialist Revolutionary Mikhail Bakunin, and even more so his, I cannot say, quote, student, or even, quote, comrade, although he exerted great influence on Bakunin, but temporary comrades in arms, the student Nechayev, who must be described as a forerunner of Bolshevism. Nechayev's ideas are set forth and criticized in A Plot Against the International, written essentially by Friedrich Engels in agreement with Marx. This is directed with extreme severity against Bakunin's revolutionary romanticism, which Nechayev had taken to the extreme, resulting in a kind of socialism in the spirit of Rinaldo Rinaldini. Bakunin had specifically glorified the Russian robbers and had gone so far as to declare that if revolution were to take place, the penitentiaries would have to be open. This is speculation on elements that, without regard for theory, morality, etc., were simply opposed to an ordered society. The rejection of such fantasies and the emphasis on the connection between the development of socialism and the development of the economy in general, that is, ultimately of the mode of production, is the defining idea of Marx's teaching. In this regard, the already quoted sentence from the preface to Capital, that contemporary society, the society of liberal economics, is, quote, not a solid crystal, but a transformable organism subject to a constant process of transformation, end quote, is far more important than many other frequently quoted sentences. In Capital, Marx says elsewhere speaking of factory legislation and describing the effect of the 10-hour day on the Lancashire cotton workers, quote, "Nevertheless, the principle had triumphed with its victory in the great branches of industry, which are the very creation of the modern mode of production. Their wonderful development from 1853 to 1860, hand in hand with the physical and moral rebirth of the factory workers, struck the dullest eye," end quote. Marx. And in connection with the previously quoted sentence in the preface, Marx says, quote, "In England, the process of transformation, parenthesis, the process of social transformation, in parenthesis, is palpable. At a certain peak, it must rebound to the continent. There, it will take more brutal or more humane forms, depending on the degree of the development of the working class itself. Aside from higher motives, the self-interest of the current ruling classes therefore dictates the removal of all legally controllable obstacles that hinder the development of the working class. That is why, among other things, I have devoted such extensive space in this volume to the history, content, and results of English factory legislation. One nation should and can learn from another," end quote. Marx. This too reveals, I might say, a strong reformist slant in Marx's thought, provokingly revolutionary teachings. The further Marx progresses in his intellectual development, the more precisely expresses the idea of the connection between the level of economic development and the possibilities for legal and political intervention. In 1875, in his letter on the draft of the Gotha program of the then United Social Democracy, Marx stated, quote, "Law can never be higher than the economic structure and the resulting cultural development of society," end quote. Marx. Now, in Bolshevism, I emphasize again, in its doctrine, exclamation point, all of this is ignored or circumvented. Bolshevism either relies on the Communist Manifesto with its succinctly pointed statements, which nevertheless belong to the early period of Marx and Engels, when they delighted in, quote, "to emulate the bourgeois," end quote, to say something astonishing to the bourgeois. Or it gives later statements by Marx, taking them out of context, the crudest and most crude interpretation. Thus, in the penultimate of the first volume of Capital, in a second. Where am I? Where am I? Thus, in the penultimate chapter of the first volume of Capital, which characterizes the historical tendency of capitalist accumulation, Marx says, quote, "The concentration of the means of production and the socialization of labor reach a point, bracket, namely in the course of capitalist development," Eduard Bernstein, end bracket, "where they become unbearable with their capitalist shell. The hour of capitalist private property strikes, the expropriators are expropriated," end quote. Marx. So, when development itself becomes incompatible with the capitalist shell, then the expropriators, Marx calls capitalists, quote, "expropriators," because, in competition, the large capitalists expropriate the small capitalists, are expropriated. From this sentence, which paints a historical perspective, the Bolsheviks developed the slogan, quote, "rob the robbers," end quote. Workers took this literally and often applied it drastically. Entrepreneurs are portrayed as moral thieves, not as economic expropriators. Thus, in direct contrast to Marx, who in the preface to Capital, where he explains that in the book, capitalists and landowners do not fare very well and are not portrayed in a rosy light, explicitly states, quote, "But this is a personification of economic categories. My standpoint, which conceives of the development of the economic social formation as a natural historical process, can less than anyone else's hold the individual responsible for conditions of which he remains socially a creature, however much he may subjectively rise above them," end quote. Marx. In every respect, I say, the Bolshevik doctrine has coarsened Marx's teaching on these points, one could even say barbarized them. The historical, i.e. necessary function of the entrepreneur as the driving agent of production, up to a certain level of economic development, has been erased. This, too, contradicts Marx, who in the third volume of his book Das Kapital, which admittedly few have read, argues in one of the last chapters, the 24th, dealing with sources of income, that surplus labor, as the labor of the worker, must always remain beyond the measure of given needs, and adds the sentence already quoted, quote, "It is one of the civilizing aspects of capital that it enforces this surplus labor in a manner and under conditions that are more advantageous to the development of the productive forces of social relations and to the creation of the elements for a higher regeneration than are the earlier forms of slavery and serfdom." End quote. Marx shows again that capital, however sharply Marx attacks capital, fulfills important progress promoting, and he explicitly says civilizing functions in the development of human society. Bolshevism coolly ignored all this and the resulting consequences for economic policy, treating violence as the all-creator. Among leading Bolsheviks, one finds, to a certain extent, even more so than with Lenin, with Bukharin, Zinoviev, and others, statements in which violence is simply ascribed the magical powers of a panacea. One only needs to have the power, and then one can direct developments according to one's will! Exclamation point. Here are some examples of this. Marx says this is also important. In 1859, in the preface to the book A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, quote, all social formations never perish. Quote, a social transformation never perishes before all the productive forces for which that social formation is sufficiently advanced have been developed, and new higher relations of production never take their place before the material conditions of their existence have been hatched in the womb of the old society itself. End quote. Marx. In the preface to the first volume of Capital, we read, quote, even if a society has discovered the natural law of its movement, and it is the ultimate goal of this work to reveal the economic law of motion of modern society, it can neither skip nor dismiss natural phases of development, but it can shorten and mitigate the birth pangs. End quote. Marx. So Marx. Now take Nikolai Bukharin's work, The Program of the Communists, Bolsheviks, end parenthesis. There, the socialist revolution through the dictatorship of the working class in Russia, a country still underdeveloped throughout, is openly proclaimed as a matter of the immediate present, with the remark, quote, the dictatorship of the working class means the state power of the working class strangling the bourgeoisie and the landowners, end quote. And immediately afterwards, quote, this power of the workers can only arise from the socialist revolution of the working class, which destroys the bourgeois state and bourgeois power, end quote. Bukharin. And this is written in a country that, as is well known, has never had a bourgeois state. Furthermore, it states that the dictatorship must be, quote, iron, a word that, as in this text, recurs countless times in Bolshevism literature and is interpreted in the most brutal sense. A few pages later on, one reads, quote, we now see that a violation of all freedoms is necessary in relation to the opponents of the revolution. There can be no freedoms in the revolution for the enemies of the people and the revolution, end quote. Bukharin. Not only are all bourgeois parties indiscriminately portrayed as enemies of the revolution, but also those socialists, parenthesis, Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, and parenthesis, who take a different standpoint from the Bolsheviks. This is the most extreme terrorism imaginable. In Leon Trotsky's book, Soviet Power and International Imperialism, a lecture Trotsky gave to untrained Russian workers, we read, quote, in the middle, however, would be the politicians who turn somewhat to the left, sometimes to the left, sometimes to the right. These are the representatives of the Mensheviks and the right-wing social revolutionaries. They would say, quote, power must be shared equally, end quote, Trotsky. Trotsky tells this to workers, and he continues, quote, but, comrades, power is not a loaf of bread that can be cut in half and then divided into 4 parts, end quote. Trotsky. What a comparison and what a denial of history, exclamation point. The purpose is demonstrated by the following sentence. Trotsky lectures, quote, power is the instrument by which a particular class consolidates its rule. The instrument either serves the working class or it serves against the working class, end quote. Trotsky. This eliminates the development in the lives of nations. There is no transition from one social condition to the opposite, no development, but only the inversion by power. It continues like this, quote, "There is no choice here. As long as there are two enemies, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and with it the poorest peasantry, and as long as these two enemies are fighting each other, they obviously cannot have a common weapon. It is inconceivable that a cannon can serve one army as well as the other." End quote. Trotsky. To properly assess the nature of this argument, one must remember the circumstances under which it was put forward and the level of development of the country in which it was impressed upon the workers. Marx and Engels never presented the political question to the workers in such a childishly simplistic contrast. Even when Germany was already at a considerably higher economic level than the Russia of 1918, not to mention its cultural development, they still declared it advisable for the socialist working class to provide temporary support to the advanced bourgeoisie. Following the pattern of the above deductions, adapted to the conceptual capacity of very naive and undeveloped people, which run through the entire lecture, translated into all languages as a propaganda pamphlet, and alternate with similarly strange assertions about the causes and active forces of the World War, Trotsky comes to speak of the exercise of political power by the Bolsheviks and claims, with the following arguments, an excuse for their mistakes. Quote, "Some say, why did you," Jesus Christ, quote, some say, "Why did you take power if you didn't first learn how to use it?" But we answer, how could we learn carpentry if we didn't have carpentry tools in our hands? To learn to govern a country, one must take up the ruler. One must take up state power. No one has ever learned to ride a horse while sitting in a room. To learn, one must saddle a horse and get on it. Perhaps the horse will rear and fall more than once, or even more than twice. We will get up, saddle it again, and ride again, and that's how we will learn." End quote. Trotsky. If such experimentation only concerned individuals who wanted to learn to ride, that is, to govern, one could say, all well and good. But to conduct violent, far-reaching economic experiments with an entire state into the unknown, with the idea that it might go wrong, but then you just do it again, to treat a large nation in this way, potentially leaving hundreds of thousands to hunger, want, and annihilation, is something else entirely. For the social reformer, the revolutionary, there is also a categorical imperative. To have ignored this, to have cast aside the scientific teachings of the great thinkers to which they referred, wherever they did not suit them, is indicative of the missing element in the Bolshevik thought processes. In stating this, it does not occur to me to cast any suspicion on the Bolsheviks' motives. As in every revolutionary movement, there are naturally a large number of idealists in this one too, but there are certainly other types within it as well. However, I will leave this point aside. The issue here is the doctrine, the way of thinking, and how it affects the Bolsheviks' actions. But this shows how much they deviate from the views of the great master and thinker, Karl Marx. They admit almost no social conditioning for their actions. It is enough for them that, along with a certain amount of large-scale industry, there is also a proletariat in the state strong enough to play an active role in the seizure of power. But otherwise, in a wide variety of their writings, those socialists, whether Marxist or not, who emphasize a certain maturity of the proletariat and a degree of maturity of economic development as a condition for socialist transformation, are ridiculed, mocked, or even insulted. As the latter, for example. For example, what happened to a, one might say, genuine Marxist like Karl Kautsky, whom Lenin and his comrades branded as a renegade because he criticized their methods? I will say nothing of my humble self. Bolshevism recognizes almost no limits to the will in history. The most disastrous feature of Bolshevik policy is that they act as if there were nothing of the kind for the will of the revolutionary reformer. In the maxims of their measures, they are far more the image of original Tsarism. In the maxims of their measures, they are far more the image of original Tsarism than the image of Marxism. Of Marxism, they are merely a caricature. For what is significant about Marx is precisely that Marx and Engels' teachings are scientifically based doctrines of the limits of the will in the history of human society. This doctrine has often been called fatalistic, but that is entirely erroneous. Marxism is far from denying the significance of the will in history or misjudging the will's necessity. There was a democratic poet who has long been forgotten, who was once widely read and inspired many, the young deceased Friedrich von Zalett, the author of The Layman's Gospel. In one of Friedrich von Zalett's poems, Historical Development, Friedrich von Zalett sang during the period of political stagnation in Germany, quote, "We are told, youth with too hot blood should renounce the enthusiastic urge to create. Only historically does good develop. But tell me, where nothing happens, is that history?" End quote. Friedrich von Zalett. Marx fully recognizes this standpoint. It is entirely consistent with his theory, but what one does can only be achieved in relation to the given forces and conditions of development. In his polemic against Dühring, Friedrich Engels devoted several remarkable chapters to this subject, which have once again become highly relevant today. One of them particularly aptly addresses the Bolshevik method of equating very different things based on external characteristics, and failing to pay due attention to the historical conditioning of social institutions. Dühring had spoken of Greek slavery, on which the entire Greek culture was based, and equated it with wage labor. Engels responded, quote, "If one says that wage bondage is only the same as slavery, then one could say that cannibalism is the same as wage bondage, for the original idea was not slavery, but the devouring of the subjugated. However often in history mere violence has been against economic development. However often in history mere violence has been against economic development. Violence either goes with economic development, in which case violence fulfills its purpose, or violence goes against economic development, in which case, under certain circumstances, coercion, especially when rude peoples attack civilized peoples, leads to the ruin of the entire culture, or then, over time, the economic factor prevails over violence, which is subject to violence. End quote. Engels. Well, the Bolsheviks had to learn this lesson, as they themselves can no longer deny. Wherever their violent measures ignored economic factors, they suffered miserable shipwreck. Unfortunately, the Russian people had to pay the price of this experience with countless sacrifices. What is precisely magnificent about Marx and Engels is the limitation that the will experiences in history. Namely, it experiences it in two ways. Under certain circumstances against the revolution, but then again for the revolution. On a sheet of paper that Friedrich Engels gave me from Marx's papers, a piece of Marx's first draft, which was never printed, of the Communist Manifesto, there is, among other things, a phrase that Marx calls out to the representatives of the old society, who declare that society is fundamentally indestructible. Quote, "You are backward-turned utopians," end quote. That is to say, you want to halt development, deny that there can be any other form of society beyond yours, want to claim that yours is the last. But if you declare that, you are backward-turned utopians. Marxism emphasizes the power of the will with all its might. It does, of course, discourage workers from undertaking enterprises depending on whether the necessary objective preconditions for this are still lacking. But it also encourages them and protects them from discouragement. The workers' movement, influenced by the spirit of Marxism, clearly testifies to this. Quote, "Victory with us," end quote, is its leitmotif. The feeling, quote, "We will win after all. We represent the cause of the future," end quote. Ignoring the limits of the power of will, however, is the fatal miscalculation in Bolshevism's politics. It explains their many economic blunders, which they have been forced to admit one after another. Bolshevik politics is a continuous, clumsy experimentation, and entire literature has provided overwhelming evidence of this. Certainly, one finds much that is compelling in the Bolshevik decrees and drafts, magnificent plans regarding education and social welfare, regarding the organization of production and circulation, regarding the extraction and utilization of natural resources, and much more. But similar things can also be found elsewhere in the literature of socialism. The literature of the socialist utopians of the 18th and early 19th centuries is full of often magnificent ideas and ingenious designs. An extraordinary amount of spirit and intelligence was squandered, and much was recently conceived on paper. And much was excellently conceived on paper. Some of it even found realization over time, albeit not to the extent and in the manner the speculative authors had envisioned. But virtually all the prerequisites for the Bolsheviks' plans are lacking in Russia today. Indeed, they themselves have partly destroyed them by ignoring spiritual necessities. Thus, when they came to power, they encouraged the workers to practically become masters of the factories without them assuming economic responsibility. And the result? The factory owners couldn't stand it, and the factories collapsed. The workers were simply incapable of managing the factories independently. They weren't entrepreneurs and didn't want to be. What's more, some of the workers, and curiously a large portion of the skilled workers, also left. In the Bolsheviks' own publications, one can read that a large percentage of skilled workers virtually fled the factories and went to the countryside to eke out a living as small-time artisans. Over the course of 4 years of Bolshevik rule, Russia's cities have seen their population shrink by more than a quarter, and in the countryside, land yields are steadily declining. From the dictatorship of the proletariat, which barely exists formally anymore, we have moved on to the de facto enslavement of the proletariat, from the, quote, strangulation, end quote, as Bukharin puts it, of capitalist entrepreneurs, to the cultivation of a bureaucracy the likes of which hardly any other country can boast in the same proportions in government and industry. I won't go into the details. It is not my intention to accuse the Bolsheviks of anything bad. I am only discussing the errors of Bolshevism because Bolshevism's doctrine and methods are important issues in socialism today. However, the facts I am summarily highlighting are found prominently in Bolshevik literature itself. There they are the subject of lively discussions because people fear the consequences. It is also known that the Bolsheviks have created new capitalists and are attracting foreign capitalists into the country. Despite all their political power, they are simply not masters of affairs. One thing they can certainly do, supported by their guard, they can oppress and gag wherever they please. Terrorism is still practiced unabated, but the Asian despots and African sultans understood this too. Misery in Russia is constantly growing, and the suppression of all political freedom continues. No socialist newspaper of any other persuasion can be published, nor can any bourgeois newspapers. Only Bolshevik newspapers are tolerated. There is also no freedom of assembly for those who think differently. The free economic creativity that is simply a necessity for Russia, if it is to recover in any way, has been killed. A remarkable repetition of the old Tsarist despotism. It is said of Nicholas I, who lived in the middle of the last century and was the bastion of European reaction, that when railways emerged and he now wanted one from Moscow to Petersburg, he had a map brought to him and drew a straight line. Quote, "This is how the railway will be built," end quote. It is called the Nicholas Railway. Of course, it cost a terrible amount. He ignored the soil conditions, swamps, etc., and it had to be done as the Tsar wanted it. A bit of this spirit also lives in N. Ulyanov Lenin. The result is increasing economic disruption. Wherever there is no orderly legal relationship, where uncertainty regarding the law prevails, where one does not know today which laws will be enforced tomorrow, devastation takes place. And what we hear today from Russia about that terrible famine affecting millions is also partly a result of this experimentation. It was, however, directly caused by a natural phenomenon over which humanity has so far had no control, the prodigious drought. But one must not forget that even against drought, humanity is not entirely defenseless. Where the soil is sufficiently fertilized and intensively cultivated, it is more resistant to drought than where it lacks manure, and cultivation is only superficial. But where a people, and especially an agricultural people, parenthesis, Russia is predominantly a farming country, end parenthesis, where peasants have no certainty that they will keep their land, that they will retain their harvests. They simply cultivate superficially. They put nothing into the soil. As a result of this fact, Asia Minor, for example, which was once a veritable paradise of fertility, is largely silted up, especially on the western side, under the arbitrary rule of the Turkish pashas and the arbitrary Turkish tax system, the tax in kind, and unfortunately, we have a similar picture in Russia. The consequences of the misunderstanding of economic laws, the material and intellectual, or rather spiritual conditions of economic life, and the functions of economic leaders at a certain stage of development are revealed in a terrible way. It was allowed to happen that the large estates, some of which were managed very efficiently and yielded large surpluses of produce, were divided among the peasants. What was the result? The surpluses ceased. Now one cannot blame the system, the party, for everything. In a revolution, many things happen against the will of the revolutionaries themselves. But in order to minimize the inevitable excesses and achieve conditions that corresponded to the need to restore economic life as quickly as possible, the cooperation of all those who stood on the foundation of the legal system created by the February 1917 revolution was required, bringing about the opposite in the delusion that all that mattered was to have power and then, as Bukharin said, to start anew once the entire bourgeois economy had been, quote, strangled, could only result in such disruption. That's what a child playing with this construction kit might do. But the idea that the conditions of existence of a people, of millions upon millions, could be dealt with in this way is the madness of a Caesar, whether by a crowned ruler or by revolutionaries. It could only gain traction among the Bolsheviks because the basic idea of their doctrine is a completely misinterpreted, excessively crude Marxism. The following should be said about this. Bolshevism has found many critics, and it seemed natural to quote some of them. However, to avoid accusations of partisanship, I refrain from doing so here. I believe I should mention only one work. It is N. Gefimov's short book, quote, On the Sociology of Bolshevism. The author, a Russian who lived through the first years of Bolshevik rule in the former Tsarist Empire, demonstrates the interconnection between Bolshevism and the movement of revolutionary terrorists in Tsarist Russia, a movement not of the working class but of classless intellectuals whose tendency to outdo one another in radicalism is understandable from the political conditions in Russia. This is how it happened that the Marxist doctrine that reached Russia received such, one must say, a brutal interpretation. Indeed, Bolshevism is a specifically Russian phenomenon, understandable in the light of the conditions that long prevailed in Russia, where the most coercive means of oppression were common under an absolutist regime. It is understandable, but that does not mean it is worthy of imitation. It is an example of the pernicious effects of a fatal error in thinking. What manifests itself in the belief in the omnipotence of brute force, in the misunderstanding of the fundamental laws of social science, and in the disregard for the organic principle in the development of human societies that have emerged from savagery. That's the end of the piece. Thanks for listening.